It's a great privilege to be here today in a place which is not often acknowledged, but it was one of the great milestones in Britain's industrial history. You know, the pioneering of deep mining kicked many big doors open, and British history wouldn't have been the same without those developments. It's also great to be at a place which has such a strong sense of its history, and it's certainly not going to die and be forgotten. On a personal level, my great-great-uncle, Tom Lancaster, the boxing champion, he started his career boxing in the old welfare hall at Hetonley Hole. So it's lovely to be here for all sorts of different reasons. But today, I'm going to talk about two of the early presidents, indeed the first and the third president of the Mining Institute in Newcastle, a building which I'm sure you all know, at Westgood Road next to the Lytton Phil. I started working at the Institute in the late 90s in the archive, and I've been going there backwards and forwards ever since. Over the last 6 or 7 years, I've been researching the history of the Institute up until the First World War, and those findings I've published in a book which is at the back there, and this talk is largely based on a couple of chapters in that book about these two very important characters. But I want to start by, when we came to the origins of the Institute, we were looking at a couple of big families that put their money into the development of mining engineering, particularly the Littles and the Simpsons. And much of that money, much of that wealth, was based on this triangle there, that's like a peninsula where the River Derwent meets the River Tyne, roughly from Wylam. Later on, after this map was made, down to there, around about Pontop. That was the epicentre of the northern coalfield, and that's where much of the people I'm going to be talking about actually come from. In the 1680s, the poet John Cleveland, quite a distinguished poet, he'd spent some time in Newcastle during the Civil War, and he was taking the mickey out of the Spanish. And he wrote this poem called News from Newcastle. And in it, he starts with, "England's a perfect world, hath Indies too. Correct your maps, Newcastle is Peru. Let the haughty Spaniard triumph till he's told, of sooty minerals we find his gold." What he was on about was that despite the Spanish pillaging and thieving and all sorts of nasty things in America and bringing the gold back, which they squandered trying to stop the Dutch becoming Protestants, England was overtaking them because we didn't have gold, but we had this black stuff, which is making this country phenomenally prosperous in comparison to other European countries. And most of that coal was coming from here. Gippside on the Derwent at one point was produced, I think, about 10% of the nation's coal from one little area. He went on to elaborate a bit further. "Our staves their mortgaged streets will soon deride." He's talking about the city of London. "Bladen their Cornhill, Stella share Cheapside." What he was saying was the money that was made up here was actually financing the city of London. It was becoming the big source of income. Indeed, the City of London as a financial centre was founded by Sir Ambrose Crowley, who had a big ironworks on the Derwent just by the confluence at the time, which at one point was the largest capitalist enterprise in the world. And that was largely, again, based in this area. So it's the area which interests us is where our two characters really come from as well. And the two families which were largely responsible for this development were the Littles and the Simpsons. And in the early 19th century, they intermarried, and they keep swapping the houses between different branches of the family. But what they were concerned about was this ever-rising demand for coal. Since the beginning of the 18th century, the appetite for coal was almost insatiable. It was Newcastle coal which allowed London to to become the first city in the world to break through the 500,000 population barrier. Up until then, cities couldn't really get much bigger because they'd burnt all the wood around them. So the idea that coal was coming down from Newcastle into London allowed London to heat, keep warm and do all sorts of things, which allowed that population to increase. It's what one historian described as a transition from a biological economy to a mineral one. And that, again, was started up here. But coal mining becomes much more technical. The early shallow pits, which were close to the banks of the Tyne and the Wear, they were worked out. They were having to go farther away from the river and deeper. And technology was at a premium. You also, in the late 18th century, you get a tremendous upsurge in geological knowledge. It's one of the foundation stones of what becomes Darwin's evolutionary theory. It's largely based on this discovery of geological time, that time was older than what the Bible said it was. And with that knowledge, you find that you have a generation of people involved in mining who know where the seams are. They know how they're formed and roughly where they're going to. And there's also, of course, a tremendous need for mechanical motive power, which is why we're here today. And again, where's that going to come from? And the Littles and the Simpsons, they knew this. You know, they knew that there was this big demand. To meet that demand, the industry was going to change. It could no longer be the small, almost craft-based industry. I mean, the average pit in the 18th century only employed 50 people. You know, they were really quite small-scale affairs. And there's a demand for a new generation of engineers with all these skills, but particularly in surveying, drafting, geology, mathematics, and engineering. And a new type of technical education was urgently required. Let's see if I can go the right way this time. And that education was really found and emanated from a little schoolhouse in Crawcrook, placed just outside Brighton, which some of you may know, run by a man called John Craigy and later his son John Alexander Craigy. It started in 1791. The Simpsons and the Littles paid his wages. They built him a house and a schoolroom, and he came down from Bellingham and he started teaching mainly young men who were the sons of colliery overmen or colliery managers. They were not the owners, but the kind of what was then the technical bosses of the pits. Their sons were sent to Craigy's and their school fees were subsidised. I mean, the parents had to pay a bit, but the Littles and the Simpsons paid the rest. They also took private pupils from non-colliery families, but generally the education was about mathematics, surveying. Used to take them around the fields around Brighton, teaching them how to survey properly. And of course, it was incredibly important to be able to survey in those periods, because who owned the coal beneath you? Whereabouts were the seams? Who was going to have the way leaves to allow that coal to be transported over fields? It was a real hot, often highly political topic. It's emphasis on accuracy and representation. You know, technical drawings. Some of the guys who went to that school, their drawings are almost works of art. Indeed, there was an exhibition at the Royal Institute last year, which was geological drawings, and quite a few of them made by members of the Institute in Newcastle. They also had a watch club where the pupils would pay so much a week into a fund, and as a company in Sheffield, Fattorini's, they would come around with the pocket watch once a week, and the pupil would get a pocket watch, and you had to keep paying your money until everybody had a watch. So they developed this kind of trusteeship. You know, nobody could afford to drop out. So it's a form of binding, and they become very close as a group because of things like the watch club that Craigy organised. Craigy succeeds right up until the 1860s, 1870s, and it's the arrival of the board school, which makes these small grammar schools obsolete, really. This is Nicholas Wood. His early years. He's born at South Myers Farm, again between Brighton and Winleighton. He attends Craigy's, and Craigy was a great mathematician and a map maker, And Wood certainly learned his skills off that. His talents were recognised very, very early, and it's the Simpsons and the Littles who send him to Killingworth, where the Littles owned the mine, to work alongside George Stephenson. Stephenson was the young talent that the Littles had picked up, and he needed people around him who could realise his dreams, as it were. And of course, Nicholas Wood is absolutely perfect for that. And that's his house over there. Oops, let's go back, press the wrong button. That's Sour Myers Farm. It's surrounded by a load of junk at the moment. But it's a sort of house that a colliery overman would live in. That would be his father. And this is Bradley Hall, nearby, where the Simpsons and the Littles lived. I call Nicholas Wood in the book the third Stephenson. I think it's a name that is, I think, justly deserved. He's George's closest collaborator, no doubt about it. He was George's draftsman. He did all the drafting for him. He was George's communicator. Much of his life, George couldn't read or write. It was Woods who handled those things for him. He becomes very closely involved in the locomotive design. They surveyed the tracks together. I mean, when Stephenson died, there's a wonderful obituary to Stephenson by Wood in the Transactions of the Institute, where he talks about when they got a coach down from Newcastle and they walked the Stockton to Darlington line all day, then somehow they got halfway back to Newcastle. He describes that journey in great, great detail, and you realise just how close they were. And of course, he entrusted the education of his son, Robert, to Nicholas Wood, Robert was Nicholas Wood's apprentice. And he also worked very, very closely with George on the miner's safety lamp. In fact, it was Nicholas who did most of the drawings for it. Except, of course, there was a controversy. And the controversy Nicholas got caught up in as well was war with Davy, Sir Humphrey Davy, the guy from Cornwall, the president of the British Institute and everything else, Britain's top scientist. A bit of a windbag, a highly popular lecturer who people used to queue outside the academy from early in the morning to attend his evening lectures. Great, great orator. But he was great at blowing his own trumpet, a great self-publicist. And during a period where there was a national thirst to have a lamp that was safe to go underground in coal mines, there's a kind of race to make one. And Davy gets in there quite early. But one of the controversies was, did he cheat? Because Stephenson and Wood were also developing their lamp. And there is some evidence that John Buddle, who was the great king of coal in the north, the great viewer, the great engineer who looked after Lord Londonderry's assets, Buddle was a Unitarian, as was Humphrey Davy in the same church. Buddle was highly educated, and he knew Davy personally. And there was rumours that Buddle was sending down Stephenson's secrets to Davy, and Davy was nicking them, as it were. What was at heart, really, was this battle royal between Northern empiricism. The Stephensons like to do things by trial and error. Let's find out how to do it. Let's try this. That doesn't work. Okay, we'll try it another way. Whereas Davy, of course, is scientific theory, models and stuff like that, abstractions, which Northern engineers didn't think much of. Frank James, who was president of the British Institute, a post held by Davy when he was alive, spent a lot of time researching the controversy. He comes down absolutely conclusively that Stephenson was first there, and that Davy did nick, and that they were cheated out of, if you like, the prize. Davy got all the honours, etc., etc. What had essentially been Stephenson and Wood's development. And this left a deep, deep resentment with Nicholas, and a deep suspicion of abstract theory. He didn't like these highfalutin London scientists with all their maths and things. He liked to... And this comes to light in his career when there's a kind of national scandal. There's children getting blown up in coal mines throughout the 20s, 30s and 40s, indeed the 50s. And there's a lot of interest because the Queen herself was deeply shocked by mining disasters and took a close personal interest in it. And there was one of the things that really got up people's backs, and the newspapers were full of it, was the system devised by John Buddle to ventilate collieries, which was to have a fire at the bottom of the shaft. You have two shafts, or you have one shaft with a dividing wall, lattice, and you have fire at the bottom of the shaft. Hot air goes up, it pulls in cold air, and you clear the air of the pit that way. And people are horrified. You know, you've got these explosive gases, and you've got a fire down there. It's just asking for trouble. And of course, it was relatively safe, but nevertheless, in terms of publicity, it was frowned upon. And in 1854, 2 years after the Institute started, another great mining engineer, who sadly we know hardly anything about, J.J. Atkinson from Wingate in Durham, I think he was at Houghton as well, he produced a paper on the ventilation of mines using steam jets and other apparatus as instead of furnaces. And Woods was incensed. He didn't like it. He was being challenged. And what made it worse was that Atkinson was highly educated. And he turned up at the Institute with a paper which he circulated beforehand, which is full of algebraic equations. And half the guys couldn't understand it because they hadn't had that type of formal scientific education. And Wood listened to Atkinson's presentation, was relatively polite, says, we'll put it on file. And one mining engineer, McPherson, the great expert on mine ventilation, says that he put that decision by Wood, put back mining ventilation by half a century. And today, even today, if you're a mining engineer and you're designing a pit, the first thing you apply when it comes to ventilation is known even today as Atkinson's formula. You know, what he presented in 1854 is still the standard formula for the ventilation of mines. Lindsay Wood, you know, Nicholas's son, when he was president, he acknowledged at a big meeting in London that his father was wrong. He was stubborn, he wasn't going to let go of his furnaces, and he was not going to admit that Atkinson was right. So he had a stubborn streak. He also has economics, because, you know, you've got a fire down the bottom of a shaft, all the bits of old coal, the little bits you can just put in the furnace, and it's cheap, doesn't cost you anything. Whereas the apparatus of ventilation was going to be expensive. And there's a colliery furnace, you can see how they do it. There's the furnace, hot air goes up, and of course it circulates, brings the coal air down, and it circulates the air around the colliery. But of course he had tremendous legacy. He carried Stephenson's prestige. You know, he was the third Stephenson. He was the most significant figure in the establishment of the professional mining engineer. And he campaigned and campaigned and he campaigned for mining higher education, which is quite a paradox. You know, he wants the science, but at the same time he doesn't want the science. He wants to have professional engineers who are highly skilled, but you know, there's a paradox to none of us are perfect. But anyone who ever goes into the Mining Institute in Newcastle will have been into the Wood Memorial Library and seen the great statue and that wonderful tribute to him, which the engineers, after he died, created, which is, of course, the great library room, one of the most beautiful rooms in Newcastle, without a doubt. Somebody who gets missed out. He's never heard of because he never became a member of the Institute for a start. And he didn't really operate in the northeast very much, but he was from Barlow near Ryton. You could probably wave out of his window to where Nicholas Wood lives. He also went to Craigy's. He's an exact contemporary of Sir George Elliot. And he was recruited not by the Littles or the Simpsons, because he was another bright star of the Academy. He was recruited by the Earl of Bute, the Marquis of Bute, who had coal mines in and around High Spen because he'd married into the Montague family and he'd got some of their northeast coal assets, as well as having vast coal assets in South Wales. He's the guy who builds Bute Town, Cardiff Docks, and opens up the valleys. He's a phenomenally wealthy man, but it's Nixon who goes down there and develops all that for him. You know, Nixon's the one who develops the mines, he develops the railways, he develops the docks, and most importantly, he's the guy who devised the longwall system of mining. You know, you never hear him, but he's the absolute revolution in mining. He does it, and the poor guy's just been forgotten. Sir George Elliot. Well, here's a character, if ever there was one. Born in 1815, he too went to Craigy's Academy. Craigy's Academy was not as big as this room, but it produced some of the greatest engineers the world has ever seen. And we know little about it. I mean, I've met one of the descendants of John Craigy, who has some bits of family history, and he has a list of some of the pupils who went there. There was a day book which Craigy kept, where he recorded what was happening in the school. That was used by a journalist in the Bladen Courier in the 1950s, and he quotes from it, and that's disappeared. And that is the holy grail of North East history, as far as I'm concerned, if that could ever be found. That would be telling you how these great guys were educated, but it's gone. We know so little about him. But Elliot went there, and he was apprenticed, because Londonderry spotted how clever he was, because Londonderry and the Littles and that, they used to meet each other at their club in Newcastle, and they're always on the lookout for bright young men. And George, who'd been born near Penshaw, the son of a colliery overman, he gets recruited by Tom Sopwith, the great mining engineer and many, many other things, great polymath, if ever there was one, as his first apprentice. And Sopwith had just opened up offices in the Royal Arcade in Newcastle, and that's where Elliot sat with Sopwith, and they did things like they surveyed the Forest of Dean coalfield, and they both worked with Robert Stephenson surveying the East Coast main line. In fact, Tom Sopwith was Stephenson's best friend. He's one of the Hetton pioneers. He was Londonderry's manager at a very, very early age. He becomes a colliery owner quite quickly. You know, he was a great guy he had a great talent at spotting where to sink shafts. You know, his sense of geology and surveying that he got from Craigy's, he could spot the right spot to sink a shaft to get the coal. And often he would say, well, sink the shaft there, and if it turns out the way I think it is, I don't want paying for it, I just want a share of the colliery. And he was so good at it, okay, we'll give you a share. And pretty soon he ended up owning several pits himself, including the one where his father worked and where he himself worked as a child. He was, of course, a great, great self-publicist. When he was standing for MP, he put it around amongst the miners that he took part as a 15-year-old in the strike of 1831, led by Tommy Hebben, who was from this village, I think. So he put that around. He wanted to make himself look a radical, but he was a Tory. But then that's in a period where Tories weren't quite what they are today. Quite often you could be a radical and a Tory because it was the Liberals who were the bosses. It was the Liberals who owned all the factories in Lancashire. The Liberals were often depicted as the mean capitalists, whereas the Tories were those nice squires who were nice to their folks and all that. So he stood as a Tory and he became an MP. But he also becomes very, very quickly becomes phenomenally rich. One of the things he did do was he bought interests in the South Wales coalfield. Bute was already there, and he knew about Bute, he knew about Nixon, because he was Nixon's exact contemporary, and he knew all about the benefits of anthracite coal, which was the main coal in South Wales. And he was lucky because he managed to buy the Powell Dufresne empire. It's a company that he's part of. It's still with us. All that controversy about Teesport and the dredging, etc., that's all bound up with Powell Dufresne, who owned the port. He is lucky because the Dufresne family ran out of heirs. They had one son left. Well, one went mad. They had one son left, and he went up in a hot air balloon over the Bristol Channel and never came back, which meant that the family had no heirs, and they sold it to Elliot, and he got some in partnership with William Armstrong, not the Newcastle William Armstrong, the one from Durham, the mining engineer, and they got it really for his song. And it's Elliot who develops that part of the Welsh coalfield, the Monmouth area, and he also builds Newport and Newport docks, very similar to what Bute had done at Cardiff, and they're great, great rivals. He owns iron, steel works, etc., etc. He was MP for Durham North, but when the boundaries were changed, he lost his seat and he moved down to Monmouth, where he became MP for Monmouth, because he had a big estate down in Monmouth as well. So he had estates all over the place. And this is a guy, who 30 years earlier was claimed to be a trapper boy down Penshaw Pit. But he is a great character in the House of Commons. He never lost his Geordie dialect. There was something unpolished about George. He became very close to Disraeli. You've got this little tubby Geordie, and Disraeli's, was he 6'7", the tallest ever Prime Minister. Disraeli's Jewish, George is Geordie, and they get on. They're both outsiders. They click, as it were. And they've become very, very close friends. And he, so close, in fact, that Elliot would often visit Disraeli's house at Hughenden for weekends, and he became very close to Lady Disraeli. In fact, the recent biography on Lady Disraeli, the author claims that they'd been intimate for a number of years. So he was in a relationship with the Prime Minister's wife, shall we say. So he's a bit of a boy. Although Disraeli loved him, because it was a strange marriage, let's put it that way. So much so that when, in the early 1870s, there was a crisis with Egypt, because Egypt couldn't pay its foreign debts, and the French wanted to go in, we wanted to go in, we eventually did go in, but nevertheless there was all sorts of problems, and Disraeli sent Elliot out to Egypt to try and sort it out, which seems a strange thing to do. You send a pitman from Durham to the international conference, but he went to the Conference of Cyprus, and he did an absolutely splendid job. Of course, before that, he'd persuaded Disraeli to buy shares in the Suez Canal. So he goes out there, he knew where he was going, and he becomes really quite close to the Khedive of Egypt, who was the representative of the Ottoman Empire. So close, and the Khedive was so pleased with Elliot's peacekeeping work that he allows him to take some pyramid stones. And of course, you will know they're in some of the local churches. One's at Rainton, the other one's at Penshaw, is it? In the walls of the church, they've got stones from the pyramid. And other bits and pieces like mummies and things like that. So he carted all these back. And it was if you were a winner in the Victorian age, it was a great period to be. You could do almost anything. And there was his mummy. When the great railway pioneer Hudson went bankrupt, Elliot bailed him out, and part of the settlement was that Elliot was given the land and the building site of the West Cliff at Whitby, what became the Royal Crescent, and he himself had a house there, and he put his Egyptian paraphernalia in his big house in the Royal Crescent. And as we'll see later on, he became very close to Bram Stoker, the author. And Stoker came up to stay with him in Whitby. And the legend has it that they both got absolutely mortal drunk. Stoker went to bed, woke up in the morning, drew the curtains, and my God, there was these mummies staring at him and all these other things. And he looked across the bay and saw Whitby Abbey, and that's where the idea of the Seven Veils and eventually Dracula comes from. So when you go to Whitby, it's full of these strange people dressed in black. It all goes back to George Elliot, so you can blame him for it. And this is the curator of Hull Museum who came up to Whitby, and he bought that mummy, I think, for 15 quid, and he put it in his open-top Riley and drove back to Hull with it, where he had an X-rayed, and it turned out it was a lady inside, not a man as they thought. And that's him with the famous X-ray. And of course, one of the things he did was he had an early interest in wire rope technology, being a mine owner. You think that people are now going down over 1,000 foot and holding on to bits of rope. Didn't bear thinking about it. So the iron steel rope really was going to be the future. And he buys a company called Glass Cable, who are based in Greenwich. And they make steel cables. And he forms a company called Glass Elliot Telegraph Cables. And he wants the cables for his pits, but also, he's an international figure, for goodness sake. He helped finance the Suez Canal. he sees the potential in intercontinental telegraphs, and he buys into glass cables, and he also bought the Gupper Percher Company, which was out in the Far East. It's like a rubbery stuff, a type of rubber, because he saw the potential there for insulation. It was very popular in the Victorian period as Gupper Percher because they made raincoats out of it and dentures and all sorts of things. But Elliot saw the potential as a form of insulating the underwater cables. And he's in direct competition with another local company called Newell, Bell and Liddell. Newell was a Scottish engineer who's based on Tyneside. Bell, if I was talking about another president, I'd be talking about Lothian Bell, but I haven't got time. He's another great engineer and coal owner. And Liddell is, of course, the descendant of the Liddell dynasty, the Ravensworths. And they all see the importance of steel rope, and they too start developing telegraph cables in competition with Elliot. So I think two presidents after Elliot is Lothian Bell. So two of the presidents of the Institute are battling over the lane of the transatlantic cable. In the end, the government says enough's enough, you can build it between you. You start that side, and meet in the middle. Which they did. And when they met, they found that they had the wrong lay. One lay was right and one lay was left. They couldn't join it up. So they come all that way in the middle. And, so, of course, immediately Bell starts blaming Elliot and vice versa. And it was a laughing stock in the Times. Fortunately, they had a very talented engineer on one of the boats who worked out how to join them up, so they managed to join it up in the end. But it became a kind of, and that's the route they took. And I call that the first instalment of the internet. Because the internet's just a cable at the end of the day. A lot of it's underwater. And there's the lay. Oh dear, one goes one way, as you can see, the other goes so it's going the wrong way around. He was a man about town. This is by Spy in Punch. He was a great socialite. Because many of you know his wife died, his daughter died tragically. His son died, one of his sons died in South Africa. And he was increasingly based in London. He's an MP, he was one of the best friends of the Prime Minister. He dined in high society despite his Geordie manners. They liked having him around because he was a bit of a character, plus he had lots of money. And he had lots of adventures in London. He was part of the fashionable lyric theatre set. So if you're a man about town in London in the 1870s and 1880s, the action, the real hotspot, was the lyric theatre. Not only the plays were put on, it was owned by Henry Irvine, and all the great stars of the period were there. And Elliot becomes very close to Henry Irvine, and he meets Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker is Henry Irvine's theatre manager. And it's a very, very close circle. He becomes part of that. So he is at the height of London fashion. Not bad for a lad from Penshaw. Not right, just check. Yeah. His downfall was a lady who under the rather grand name of Emmeline Mary Hares, and her stage name was Emilia Chiommi. The Signora Chiommi has won the caresses of the critics, caresses well merited. She is beautiful, has long fair hair, a sweet voice, a lithe and graceful figure, yet which flash with rare intelligence, a mellow, flexible, passionate voice with self-possession and distinction and gesture and movement. She was a star. She was young, amazingly beautiful. Everybody was falling for her. What we know of her is that she was born in 1852. Her father was the clerk to a flag maker. Her mother recognised her talent for singing, and she persuaded her uncle to fund her training career in Paris. She performs in London, Paris, Madrid. She lived with Wagner. Wagner took a shine to her, and she moved in with Wagner for about 6 months, which caused all the European tongues to wag, as you can imagine. Eventually she retires at the age of 22 and goes and becomes the personal singer to a French count. But then in the late 1880s, 1887, she gets caught up in what was known as the Caffarel scandal, where French honours were being sold at a price to businessmen, etc., who would pay the money. The French government would give you an honour. One of the ministers would make it that you would get the honour. It's not that different today, is it? But the main problem was the Caffarel scandal was based on very upmarket Parisian brothels. And she got caught with honours being sold in her salon on the Champs-Élysées. So the speculation then was she also a brothel keeper with her mother? But the scandal becomes so intense that she has to flee Paris very quickly. So she does a runner back to London, and she finds that she's got few assets except one of her generals had given her 2/3 of a share in a coal mine. And she didn't know much about coal mining. So she went around and said, I've got no money left, but I've got these shares in this blooming coal mine, what do I do with them? And obviously she was talking to the theatre set, which is what she was part of. And they said, well, go and talk to George Elliot, he knows all about coal mining. So a meeting was arranged at Brown's Hotel in Mayfair. And she turned up and showed him her portfolio, as it were. Arranged to meet the following week, and she stayed the night with him upstairs in the hotel. And pretty soon, he buys a house around the corner to his own house in Mayfair and moves her and her mother into this house around the corner. Scandal. He has her there for 2 years, this very convenient relationship with her and the mother around the corner, and he's still got his respectable townhouse in Mayfair. But she takes him to court, and she sues George Elliot for breach of promise. Can anybody remember that charge, breach of promise? I was very, very young when I said, there's a breach of promise case in the papers. It seems to have disappeared as an offence, as it were. But she sued him for saying that he was going to marry her and he didn't. And she claimed that he dumped her after a second miscarriage. But he's in his 70s by now. But all the dirty washing comes out in court. And the international press coverage is phenomenal. I remember doing work on North East Pitman going to Australia and looking at the Australian press in this period. And that court case was followed avidly in New South Wales, in the New South Wales coalfield. Of course, there was lots of North East miners there. The jury was split right down the middle. And she wanted to have another case. Let's go back to court, let's have another day in court. And he, according to her historian, he paid her off. And she took off to New York with her mother. No, her mother was dead by then, sorry. And she opens a massage parlour in Manhattan. She employs a Swedish gymnast and various other things. And she also gets caught up in mortgage speculation in Manhattan, and she almost goes to jail. She ends up on a boat, last tracker in the 1920s. She's on a boat going to Sweden with a Swedish Olympic masseur. And we lost track of her. But the damage had been done. After the case, he lives very quietly in London. He spends the last few years working on a plan for the future of the British coal industry. He could see all too well that the future for coal, even in the 1890s, was not bright. You could see what was coming. Once coal had been a dominant economic force because it controlled its own price. By the time you got to the 1880s, coal was just a factor in the price of iron and steel. It was iron and steel that was wagging the international commodity market, not coal. And coal could no longer be dominant. Plus, he knew that many mines were being worked out, even then. And what he proposed was, he just saw chaos looming. Keir Hardie had already started the Scottish Labour Party up in Lancaster, and it was just about to come down to England in 1892. So rather than avoid what he could see as a coming class war, he proposed a form of hybrid nationalisation. We have a board, 50% miners, 50% owners, chaired by a representative from the Board of Trade. The miners get 2/3 of the profit, the owners get 1/3. Seems okay. They're the ones doing the work. And it was praised by the Times, but most people shouldn't, because they didn't take him very seriously. He'd already, once you've lost your reputation, you can't get it back. It was very, very difficult for him. He dies and he gets a very, very generous obituary in the Times. Most of the press didn't even acknowledge his death. Once one of the richest men in Britain, one of the, a great figure who strove in the national stage. He was ignored by the trade press and the professional journals. There's not even an obituary to him in our own transactions in Newcastle. They just ignored him. He was bad news, he was bad odour. There was no portrait of him until 1904, and his son sends one up from, who was then the MP for Northallerton, sends a portrait up to the Institute, and they hang it between Nicholas Wood and George Stephenson. But I was talking to the librarian the other day, we seem to have lost it. It's disappeared. It's a big kind of mystery. What happened to George Eliot's portrait? We simply don't know. His legacy was huge. He was a man who proposed the establishment of the Institute after a little mining disaster, I say little because only about 50 people got killed, at Seaham in 1852. It was his idea to establish an institute in order to pursue the best way and safest way of mining coal, because then safety was uppermost. It was his idea to suggest the application of a royal charter, and he steered it through Parliament along with Lord Eslington, who was one of the Ravensworth clan. He played a major role in national affairs. He headed the building committee, which appointed Archibald Dunn to design, the great architect Archibald Dunn, who designed that wonderful Gothic building that we have at the bottom of Westgood Road. He has a huge global impact. He's known all over the world. I was in South Africa, right at the top of the Eastern Cape. There's some very poor quality coal, which was mined briefly in the very late 1890s. And he went to the local bank where the records were kept. His name's plastered all over the place. Even in the back of beyond, they know of George Elliot, whereas a few years later, he's largely forgotten. Both men were flawed. Both were giants, but both had their flaws. With Woods, it was stubbornness. He was right, and everybody else was wrong. And he would go down fighting that battle. Even though he did pursue a campaign to get mining engineering recognised as a university subject, which was briefly taken up by Durham for a couple of years, then they dropped it because they didn't think it was appropriate that mining should be studied in a wonderful cathedral city like Durham. Then it was going to go to Newcastle, but the Bishop of Durham, the Dean of Durham, put the mockers on that because he thought Newcastle was just a dreadful, deadly city. Combination of Sodom and Gomorrah combined. You wouldn't want to educate young people in Newcastle. It's just, when he went, we had a new dean, and he was much more amenable to the idea, and that's when we got the College of Physical and Natural Sciences started, which was partly funded by Wood's campaign, which now, of course, eventually becomes Newcastle University. Elliot, again, he's a great. He was one of the Hettonite, one of that generation of engineers called the Hettonites, who got below the limestone, which you all know about. But he was also, a railway pioneer, a phenomenal businessman. There's no doubt about it. And he was a polymath. He was a bit like he could turn his hand to anything, not just dig coal. Let's have an intercontinental telegraph system. And he does it. You have to take your hat off to him. Let's build a canal in Suez. And he gets into that. So he's got this huge global impact. And of course, he's really just misses the boat because of, he was a bit daft in his old age. If it hadn't been for that, there'd be Elliot halls and Elliot streets and Elliot everywhere, all over the northeast. But of course, he's just largely been forgotten, even though he was one of the giants of the 19th century. And, with Elliot as well, he's almost a generation younger than Wood. And he misses that boat. You know, would Samuel Smiles have picked him up when he's writing those compendiums of great Victorians? He's too late for that. And of course, when Welford does his Men of Mark betwixt Tweed and Tyne, he totally ignores him because he's bad news. And his achievements are largely forgotten. And on that contrast, I'm going to finish. Thank you.